The Minnesota winter of 2019 had been particularly unforgiving, but by early March, the residents of Bloomington were beginning to see signs of relief. The snow that had blanketed the Twin Cities metropolitan area for months was finally starting to recede, revealing patches of brown grass and the promise of spring. For Michael Thompson, a 38-year-old senior financial analyst at Wells Fargo's regional headquarters, the changing season represented more than just warmer weather. It symbolized growth, renewal, and the bright future he was building with his wife of 7 years, Jennifer. Michael Thompson was the kind of man who inspired quiet confidence. Standing at 6 feet tall, with an athletic build maintained through regular morning runs along the Minnesota River, he possessed an understated charisma that drew people to him. His colleagues at Wells Fargo respected his analytical mind and his ability to remain calm under pressure. During quarterly reviews and high-stakes client presentations, Michael was often the person managers turned to when they needed someone who could deliver complex financial projections with clarity and confidence. He had joined the company straight out of the University of Minnesota's Carlson School of Management in 2005, and over 14 years, he had steadily climbed the corporate ladder through dedication and genuine talent. But work, important as it was, had never been the center of Michael's universe. That honor belonged to his family. Jennifer Thompson, née Harrison, had been his college sweetheart. They met during their junior year at a campus coffee shop, where Michael had accidentally spilled his cappuccino on Jennifer's economics textbook. What began as an embarrassed apology and an offer to replace the damaged book evolved into coffee dates, study sessions, and eventually a relationship neither of them could imagine living without. Jennifer, with her infectious laugh and sharp wit, complemented Michael perfectly. Where he was measured and analytical, she was spontaneous and creative. She worked as a marketing director for a boutique advertising firm in downtown Minneapolis, and together they represented the epitome of young professional success in the Twin Cities. Their home in Bloomington, a comfortable 2-story colonial in a quiet residential neighborhood, reflected their combined tastes and aspirations. Jennifer had insisted on the house when they found it in 2015, charmed by its large backyard and proximity to excellent schools. The couple had been trying to start a family for the past 2 years, and though they had faced some disappointments along the way, they remained hopeful and committed to the journey. The extra bedroom upstairs had been carefully prepared as a nursery, painted in soft yellow with white trim, a gender-neutral choice that Jennifer had selected with characteristic optimism. Michael's typical weekday followed a comfortable routine that had become almost ritualistic over the years. He woke at 5:30 each morning, careful not to disturb Jennifer, and dressed quietly in running gear. His route took him through their neighborhood and along a scenic path that bordered Highland Lake Park Reserve. The early morning runs were his meditation, a time when he could think through work challenges, plan his day, and simply enjoy the solitude. By 7 o'clock, he would return home, shower, and join Jennifer for breakfast. They treasured these morning moments together, discussing their schedules over coffee and toast, sharing plans for the weekend, and maintaining the connection that had sustained their marriage through various challenges. On this particular Thursday in mid-March, Michael's morning had been no different. He had completed his 5-mile run, feeling energized despite the lingering chill in the air. Over breakfast, Jennifer had mentioned that she had a late meeting with a potential client and might not be home until after 8 that evening. Michael had kissed her goodbye at 7:45, grabbed his briefcase, and driven his silver Honda Accord toward downtown Minneapolis, where the Wells Fargo Tower stood as a gleaming testament to corporate Minnesota. He arrived at his desk on the 15th floor by 8:30, exchanging pleasantries with co-workers and settling into his morning routine of reviewing market reports and preparing for a 10 o'clock conference call with regional directors. What Michael did not know What he could not possibly have known as he reviewed quarterly earnings reports and sipped his second cup of coffee that morning was that someone had been watching him. Not just that day, but for weeks. Someone had studied his routines with meticulous attention, noting the time he left for his morning run, the route he took, the car he drove, and the building where he worked. Someone had photographed him from a distance, saved images of him on a smartphone, and harbored an obsession so intense that it had transformed from fixation into something far darker and more dangerous. The someone in question was a man named David Richter, though Michael Thompson had no reason to know that name or to fear it. David was 33 years old, originally from a small town in Wisconsin, and he had become completely consumed by an infatuation that had begun nearly 2 years earlier under circumstances that seemed at first entirely innocent. David had met Jennifer Thompson at a professional networking event in downtown Minneapolis in the summer of 2017. Jennifer, attending on behalf of her advertising firm, had been tasked with making connections and potentially identifying new business opportunities. David, who worked in IT consulting for a small firm based in St. Paul, had struck up a conversation with her during the cocktail reception. They had talked about marketing trends, technology integration, and the challenges of working for smaller companies in competitive markets. For Jennifer, it had been a forgettable professional interaction, one of dozens she engaged in regularly as part of her job. She had exchanged business cards with David, as she did with many people at such events, and perhaps followed up with a brief LinkedIn connection. She thought nothing more of it. For David Richter, however, that 20-minute conversation had been transformative. He had become instantly captivated by Jennifer, reading far more into her professional friendliness than was ever intended. In his mind, Jennifer's polite smile and engaged listening represented genuine interest, perhaps even attraction. He convinced himself that they had shared a connection, something special that transcended the mundane circumstances of a networking event. In the months that followed, David's interest had evolved into obsession. He began following Jennifer on social media, studying every post, every photograph, every comment. He learned about her husband Michael, about their home in Bloomington, about their hopes for starting a family. Rather than tempering his fixation, learning about Jennifer's marriage only seemed to intensify it. In David's increasingly distorted thinking, Michael Thompson was not Jennifer's beloved husband, but rather an obstacle, an impediment preventing Jennifer from recognizing what David believed was her true destiny with him. The delusion grew, fed by isolation, rejection from other romantic pursuits, and an inability to distinguish fantasy from reality. By late 2018, David's behavior had escalated beyond social media monitoring. He began driving past Jennifer's house in Bloomington, parking down the street to watch the comings and goings of the Thompson household. He learned Michael's schedule, noting when he left for work and when he returned. He discovered the route of Michael's morning runs and occasionally followed at a distance, observing from his car. David told himself he was simply learning more about Jennifer's life, convincing himself that if he could just understand her world completely, he would find the right moment to approach her, to make her see that they were meant to be together. The fact that Jennifer had shown no interest in him beyond that single professional conversation never registered in his distorted perception of reality. David's obsession reached a critical turning point in January 2019, when he finally worked up the courage to approach Jennifer directly. He had waited outside her office building in downtown Minneapolis on a Friday evening, timing his arrival to coincide with the end of her workday. When Jennifer emerged from the building, David had stepped forward and greeted her, reminding her of their meeting 18 months earlier and suggesting they grab coffee to discuss potential business collaboration. Jennifer, caught off guard but trying to remain professional, had politely declined, explaining that she was meeting her husband for dinner and did not have time. She had been kind but firm, and she had not given David any reason to believe there was interest beyond professional courtesy. For most people, such a rejection would have been disappointing but understandable. For David Richter, it was devastating and infuriating. In his mind, Jennifer's refusal was not her own choice, but rather the result of Michael's influence, Michael's control over her life. David convinced himself that Jennifer wanted to spend time with him but felt trapped in her marriage, unable to express her true feelings. The rejection, rather than serving as a reality check, only hardened his resolve. If Jennifer could not see clearly because of her husband's presence, then perhaps the solution was to remove Michael from the equation entirely. The thought, once it entered David's mind, took root and began to grow with terrifying determination. Over the following weeks, David's planning became more methodical and more sinister. He researched Michael Thompson extensively, learning everything he could about the man he now viewed as his primary enemy. He discovered Michael's LinkedIn profile, his professional background, his interests, and his habits. David began formulating a plan, one that would eliminate Michael and, in his warped reasoning, free Jennifer to finally recognize the connection David was certain they shared. The plan was insane, criminal, and destined to destroy multiple lives, but David Richter, lost in his delusion, could see none of that. He saw only an obstacle that needed to be removed and a future that he believed was rightfully his. As March progressed and the Minnesota winter finally began its retreat, David made his final preparations. He purchased items he would need, researched locations, and rehearsed scenarios in his mind. He told himself he was doing this for love, that Jennifer would eventually understand and be grateful. The truth, of course, was far different. David Richter was preparing to commit murder, driven by obsession, rejection, and a complete detachment from reality. And Michael Thompson, going about his daily life with no awareness of the danger closing in around him, had no idea that his time was running out. The third week of March brought unseasonably warm temperatures to the Twin Cities, and with them came a collective sense of relief among Minnesota residents who had endured yet another brutal winter. Michael Thompson found himself in particularly good spirits. Wells Fargo had just approved a significant promotion he had been working toward for over a year, elevating him to Senior Vice President of Regional Financial Analysis. The promotion came with increased responsibilities, a substantial salary increase, and the validation that his 14 years of dedication had not gone unnoticed. He had celebrated with Jennifer over dinner at Manny's Steakhouse in downtown Minneapolis, where they toasted to his success and discussed what the additional income might mean for their future. Jennifer had been genuinely thrilled for her husband, but she also shared her own professional news that evening. Her advertising firm had landed a major account with a national retail chain, and Jennifer had been selected to lead the creative team. It meant longer hours in the short term, but it also represented a career milestone she'd been pursuing since joining the company 5 years earlier. As they clinked wine glasses across the candlelit table, both Michael and Jennifer felt that their lives were finally aligning in the way they had always hoped. The struggles with fertility treatments had been emotionally draining, but their careers were thriving, their marriage remained strong, and they maintained hope that parenthood would eventually become a reality. What they could not see, what existed beyond their awareness in a realm of darkness they never suspected, was the figure who had been documenting their celebration from across the restaurant. David Richter had followed Jennifer from her office that evening, maintaining a careful distance as he tracked her movements through downtown Minneapolis. When she had met Michael outside Manny's, David had felt a surge of rage so intense that his hands trembled as he gripped his steering wheel. He watched them enter the restaurant together, observed through the window as they were seated, and saw the obvious affection and happiness they shared. Each smile, each laugh, each intimate gesture between husband and wife felt like a personal betrayal to David, confirmation that Michael Thompson had stolen what rightfully belonged to him. David had remained parked outside the restaurant for the entire 2 hours that Michael and Jennifer dined inside. He used the time to review his plan once more, mentally rehearsing each step. He had purchased a hunting knife 3 weeks earlier from a sporting goods store in Eau Claire, Wisconsin, paying cash to avoid any transaction record tied to his credit cards. The knife now rested in a locked case beneath the passenger seat of his aging Ford Explorer, waiting for the moment David had been planning with obsessive precision. He had studied Michael's morning running route so thoroughly that he could walk it blindfolded. He knew exactly where the path ran through isolated sections of Highland Lake Park Reserve, where early morning joggers ran alone with nothing but trees and the distant sound of traffic for company. The plan itself was disturbingly simple in David's mind. He would intercept Michael during one of his morning runs, specifically targeting a section of the trail that curved through dense woods, approximately 2 miles from the Thompson home. The area was secluded enough that confrontation would likely go unwitnessed, especially in the early morning hours when few other runners were out. David had rehearsed his approach repeatedly, driving to the location at dawn multiple times to understand the patterns of foot traffic and identify the optimal position. He told himself that he was simply removing an obstacle, that Michael's death would be quick and necessary, and that Jennifer would eventually come to understand that everything he did was motivated by love. The delusion was complete and terrifying in its intensity. David Richter had convinced himself so thoroughly of a narrative that existed only in his imagination that reality had become entirely negotiable. He viewed Michael not as an innocent victim, but as a competitor who had unfairly won a prize David believed should have been his. He saw Jennifer not as a married woman who had clearly rejected his advances, but as someone trapped and waiting to be rescued. And he interpreted his own actions not as the criminal obsession of a dangerous stalker, but as the noble pursuit of true love against impossible odds. It was a fantasy built on delusion, but David had invested so completely in the fiction that distinguishing truth from invention had become impossible. As March moved toward its conclusion, David's surveillance intensified. He took vacation time from his IT consulting job, telling his supervisor he needed to deal with family matters in Wisconsin. Instead, he spent nearly every day monitoring the Thompson household, memorizing schedules, watching patterns, and waiting for the perfect opportunity. He photographed Michael from distance, dozens of images saved on his smartphone showing Michael leaving for work, returning home, and embarking on his morning runs. David studied these photographs obsessively, searching for vulnerabilities, analyzing routines, and building his confidence that the plan would succeed. On the evening of March 27th, David made his final preparation. He drove to Highland Lake Park Reserve well after dark, parking in a remote section of the lot where his vehicle would attract minimal attention. He walked the trail section where he intended to intercept Michael, using his smartphone flashlight to navigate the path and identify the precise location. The spot he selected was perfect for his purposes. The trail curved sharply around a cluster of old oak trees, creating a natural blind spot where someone positioned just off the path would remain invisible until a runner was nearly upon them. The nearest houses were several hundred yards away through thick woods, and the early morning hour would ensure minimal foot traffic from other exercises. David stood in that spot for nearly 20 minutes, visualizing how the confrontation would unfold. He imagined Michael appearing around the curve, unsuspecting and vulnerable. He rehearsed his own movements, calculating the seconds it would take to close the distance and strike. The knife would be hidden in his jacket pocket, easily accessible when the moment arrived. He told himself he felt no guilt because Michael Thompson deserved what was coming, that removing this obstacle was not murder, but rather justice, a necessary action to correct an unfair situation and claim what rightfully belonged to him. The moon hung low over the Minnesota landscape as David returned to his Explorer that night, satisfied that everything was in place. Tomorrow morning, he decided. Tomorrow would be the day he finally acted, the day he removed Michael Thompson from Jennifer's life and began building the future he had convinced himself they were destined to share. He drove back to his apartment in St. Paul, his mind racing with anticipation and adrenaline. Sleep would be difficult, but that did not matter. By this time tomorrow, everything would be different. Jennifer would be free, and David would finally have the opportunity to show her what he believed they could be together. What David Richter could not foresee, what his obsession and delusion prevented him from comprehending, was that his plan was not the brilliant strategy he imagined, but rather the desperate action of a dangerous man whose grip on reality had completely shattered. Tomorrow would indeed change everything, but not in the way David envisioned. Tomorrow would mark the beginning of the end, not just for Michael Thompson, but for David Richter himself. March 28th dawned cold and overcast, with temperatures hovering just above freezing. Michael Thompson's alarm sounded at 5:30, as it did every weekday morning, pulling him from a dreamless sleep. He silenced the device quickly, not wanting to disturb Jennifer, who lay beside him still deep in slumber. She had worked late the previous evening, not arriving home until nearly 10 o'clock, exhausted from her new project demands. Michael had already been in bed when she arrived, though he had waited up to hear about her day before they both surrendered to sleep. Moving quietly through the darkened bedroom, Michael gathered his running clothes and dressed in the bathroom. He pulled on thermal running tights, a long-sleeved moisture-wicking shirt, and his favorite Minnesota Twins windbreaker. Despite the calendar indicating spring's arrival, Minnesota mornings still carried winter's bite, and Michael had learned years ago to dress in layers. He laced up his Brooks running shoes, grabbed his smartphone and wireless earbuds, and descended the stairs as silently as possible. In the kitchen, he drank a glass of water and performed his usual stretching routine, loosening muscles still stiff from sleep. By 5:55, Michael stepped out his front door into the pre-dawn darkness. The neighborhood remained quiet, most houses still dark as their occupants slept. Streetlights cast pools of orange illumination along the empty sidewalks, and Michael could see his breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. He locked the door behind him, tucked his house key into the small zippered pocket of his windbreaker, and began his warm-up walk toward the entrance of Highland Lake Park Reserve. Located approximately half a mile from his house, Michael had been running this same route for years, finding comfort in its familiarity. The path through the park offered a peaceful escape from urban life, winding through woods and alongside the lake, providing scenery that changed with the seasons. In summer, the trail exploded with green foliage and wildflowers. In autumn, it became a corridor of brilliant reds and golds. Winter transformed it into a stark, beautiful landscape of bare branches and snow. Now, in late March, it existed in that transitional state between seasons, muddy and brown in places, with patches of stubborn snow still clinging to shaded areas. As Michael entered the park and began his run, he scrolled through his music playlist and selected a podcast about financial markets that he had been meaning to catch up on. The earbuds settled comfortably in his ears, and the familiar voice of the podcast host provided companionship as his feet found their rhythm on the trail. Michael's breathing settled into the steady pattern of an experienced runner, and his mind began to wander through the day ahead. He had an important presentation scheduled for 11 o'clock with the executive board, unveiling his strategic analysis for the upcoming quarter. He mentally reviewed his talking points, visualizing the PowerPoint slides and anticipating potential questions. The trail curved deeper into the woods, and the ambient light from streetlights and houses faded behind him. This section of the path remained dark, even in full daylight, due to the dense canopy of oak and maple trees overhead. Michael had run through here countless times and knew every route, every turn, every slight incline. His feet moved automatically, requiring no conscious thought to navigate the familiar terrain. The podcast continued in his ears, discussing market volatility and investment strategies, subjects that normally captured his complete attention. David Richter had been waiting in position since 5:15 that morning, positioned exactly where he had planned, just beyond the sharp curve in the trail, where oak trees created natural concealment. He had barely slept the previous night, his mind racing with anticipation and adrenaline. When his own alarm sounded at 4:30, he had risen immediately, dressed in dark clothing and driven to the park under cover of darkness. He parked his Explorer in a different lot than usual, one farther from the trail section where he planned to wait, reducing the chance that anyone might later connect his vehicle to the location. The hunting knife rested in his jacket pocket, its weight a constant reminder of what he was about to do. David's hands trembled slightly, though whether from cold, fear, or excitement he could not say. He had positioned himself behind a large oak tree, approximately 15 feet from the trail, close enough to act quickly, but far enough to remain invisible to anyone approaching. From this vantage point, he could see perhaps 30 yards up the trail in the direction from which Michael would come. The early morning darkness provided additional cover, though twilight was beginning to brighten the eastern sky. David heard Michael before he saw him. The sound of footfalls on the packed dirt trail reached his ears, accompanied by the rhythmic breathing of someone maintaining a steady running pace. David's heart rate accelerated dramatically, pounding so hard he feared Michael might somehow hear it. His right hand moved to his jacket pocket, fingers closing around the knife's handle. Everything he had planned, everything he had rehearsed, was about to become reality. Michael appeared around the curve, his form gradually materializing from the pre-dawn gloom. He ran with the easy gait of someone completely comfortable in their routine, head slightly forward, arms pumping steadily. The white earbuds were visible even in the dim light, and Michael's attention was clearly focused on whatever he was listening to rather than his surroundings. He had no reason to expect danger here, no reason to be alert for threats in this familiar place where he had run safely hundreds of times before. David stepped from behind the tree, positioning himself directly in Michael's path. The movement was sudden enough that Michael reacted instinctively, pulling up short and yanking one earbud from his ear. Confusion crossed his face as he registered the presence of another person blocking the trail at this early hour. For a brief moment, both men simply stared at each other, separated by perhaps 10 feet, the distance between normalcy and nightmare. "Can I help you?" Michael asked, his tone more puzzled than alarmed. He still perceived this as perhaps another runner or an early morning walker, someone who might need directions or assistance. David said nothing. Words had fled his mind, replaced by pure action born from weeks of obsessive planning. He closed the distance between them in 3 quick strides, his right hand emerging from his pocket with the knife already positioned for attack. Michael's eyes widened in shock as he registered the weapon, his body beginning to react even as his mind struggled to process what was happening. The attack was brutal and sudden. David drove the blade forward with desperate strength, aiming for Michael's torso. Michael twisted sideways, the defensive movement saving him from the full force of the initial strike, but the knife still found flesh, cutting deep into his left shoulder. Pain exploded through Michael's body, and he cried out, stumbling backward. His training and instincts kicked in. He raised his arms defensively and tried to create distance, backing away from his attacker, while his mind screamed questions he had no time to articulate. David advanced again, wild-eyed and relentless. He swung the knife in a wide arc, and Michael barely avoided the blade as it passed inches from his face. Michael grabbed for David's wrist, managing to catch it briefly, and the 2 men grappled on the trail. They were roughly the same size, but David had surprise and the weapon while Michael had shock and a rapidly bleeding shoulder working against him. They crashed together into the muddy ground beside the trail. Rolling and fighting for control of the knife, Michael fought with the desperate strength of someone battling for survival. But David fought with the manic intensity of obsession given physical form. The knife changed hands twice during the struggle, each man briefly gaining and losing control. Michael managed to land several hard punches to David's face, drawing blood from his nose, but David seemed not to feel the blows. His focus remained absolute, fixed on the knife and on completing what he had come here to do. The final fatal strike came when both men were exhausted, covered in mud and blood, their breathing ragged. Michael had just managed to knock the knife from David's grip, sending it skittering across the trail into the underbrush. For a moment he thought he might survive, might escape. But David lunged after the weapon, retrieved it and turned back before Michael could run. What happened next occurred in seconds, but would echo through multiple lives forever. David's hand closed around the knife handle again, mud coating his fingers as he lifted the weapon from where it had fallen among dead leaves. Michael, still on the ground and struggling to stand despite the pain radiating from his wounded shoulder, saw the blade rise again and knew with terrible certainty that he was about to die. There was no reasoning with the wild-eyed man standing over him, no words that would stop what was coming. Michael tried to scramble backward, his shoes slipping in the mud, his left arm nearly useless from the earlier wound. The second attack was swift and devastating. David brought the knife down with both hands, driving it into Michael's chest with enough force that the blade penetrated deep between his ribs. Michael gasped, his eyes wide with shock and agony as the cold steel invaded his body. David pulled the weapon free and struck again, then again, his movements frenzied and mechanical. Blood spread rapidly across Michael's windbreaker, dark and wet in the growing dawn light. Michael's hands reached up weakly, trying to defend himself, trying to push his attacker away, but his strength was fading with each passing second. After what felt like an eternity, but was perhaps only 30 seconds, David stopped. He stood over Michael's body, breathing hard, the knife hanging loosely in his right hand. Michael lay motionless on the muddy trail, his eyes staring upward at the trees overhead, his chest no longer rising and falling. The silence that followed the violence was profound and terrible. Even the birds seemed to have stopped singing, as if nature itself recoiled from what had just occurred. Reality crashed into David's consciousness like ice water. The adrenaline that had fueled his attack began to ebb, replaced by the dawning horror of what he had done. He looked down at his hands covered in blood, then at the knife, then at Michael's lifeless form. This was not how it was supposed to happen. In David's fantasies, the act had been clean, quick, almost abstract. He had imagined removing an obstacle, not creating this scene of carnage and death. The man lying before him was not just a concept anymore, but a real human being whose life David had violently ended. Panic set in. David dropped the knife beside Michael's body and stumbled backward, nearly falling. His mind raced with fragmented thoughts. What had he done? What would happen now? How could he have believed this was the right choice? But beneath the panic, the obsession still whispered its poisonous logic. Jennifer was free now. Michael could no longer stand between them. David had accomplished what he came here to do, even if the reality was far more horrific than he had imagined. David forced himself to think. He needed to leave. Someone might discover the body at any moment. Other early morning runners could appear on the trail. He had to get away, get back to his vehicle, get somewhere safe. He looked around frantically, trying to remember where he had parked, trying to orient himself. His clothes were covered in blood and mud, making him instantly identifiable as either a victim or perpetrator of violence. He stripped off his jacket, revealing a blood-spattered shirt underneath, but it was better than nothing. As David turned to flee, he failed to notice the small detail that would eventually unravel everything. His smartphone had fallen from his pocket during the struggle, landing in the mud just off the trail. In his panic and shock, David never even realized it was missing. He ran through the woods in the direction of the parking lot, crashing through underbrush, his only thought to escape the scene before discovery. Behind him, Michael Thompson's body lay cooling in the morning air, surrounded by evidence that would tell investigators exactly what had happened here. Jennifer Thompson woke at 7:15, her alarm pulling her from deep sleep. She reached automatically for Michael's side of the bed and found it empty. the sheets cool to the touch. This was normal. Michael was always up before her, usually returning from his run around 7:30. She showered and dressed for work, then went downstairs expecting to find her husband in the kitchen, preparing breakfast or reading the morning news on his tablet. The kitchen was empty. Jennifer checked her phone. No messages from Michael, which was unusual if he had extended his run or stopped somewhere. By 8 o'clock, Jennifer began to feel the first stirrings of concern. Michael was never this late without texting. His presentation to the executive board was at 11, and he needed time to prepare. She called his cell phone. It rang several times before going to voicemail. She left a message asking him to call her back. Over the next 30 minutes, she called 3 more times, each unanswered call amplifying her worry. Something was wrong. Michael was responsible and considerate. He would not simply disappear without explanation. At 8:45, Jennifer called Wells Fargo and asked to speak with Michael's assistant. Had Michael arrived at the office early? No, the assistant confirmed they had not seen him yet. Jennifer's concern crystallized into genuine fear. She called the Bloomington Police Department and explained that her husband had gone for a morning run and had not returned. The dispatcher, hearing the anxiety in her voice, assured her that an officer would be sent to check the usual running route. Officer Sarah Chen arrived at Highland Lake Park Reserve at 9:10, accompanied by her partner, Officer Marcus Williams. They began at the main trail entrance, following the route that Jennifer had described as Michael's regular path. The morning had grown brighter, and several other runners and walkers were now using the trails. Chen and Williams moved methodically, scanning both sides of the path, calling Michael's name. They found him at 9:37, approximately 2 miles into the trail system. Officer Chen saw the body first, lying just off the path in a position that was obviously not natural. She immediately radioed for backup and an ambulance, though even from a distance she could see that medical assistance would be futile. She and Williams approached carefully, preserving the scene as much as possible. Michael Thompson lay on his back, his running clothes soaked with blood, multiple stab wounds visible on his torso and chest. The violence of the attack was immediately apparent. Within minutes, the trail became a crime scene. Yellow tape went up, cordoning off a large area around the body. Detectives from the Bloomington Police Department arrived, followed by crime scene technicians and the medical examiner. Photographs were taken from every angle. Evidence was collected meticulously. And there, half buried in mud just 3 feet from where Michael had fallen, a crime scene technician found David Richter's smartphone. Its screen cracked, but the device still functional. Detective Rachel Morrison had been with the Bloomington Police Department for 12 years, 7 of those in the homicide division. She had investigated murders ranging from domestic disputes gone wrong to gang-related shootings. But something about the Michael Thompson case struck her as particularly disturbing from the moment she arrived at the scene. The level of violence was extreme, suggesting rage or obsession rather than robbery or random attack. Nothing had been taken from the victim. His expensive running watch remained on his wrist, his wedding ring still on his finger. This was personal. Morrison walked the perimeter of the crime scene carefully, observing every detail. The struggle had clearly been intense. Mud was churned up across a wide area, indicating that both victim and attacker had fought and rolled on the ground. Blood spatter patterns told a story of multiple wounds inflicted over time, rather than a single quick attack. The medical examiner, Dr. Patricia Walsh, knelt beside Michael's body, conducting her preliminary examination. She looked up as Morrison approached. Multiple stab wounds, at least 7 that I can count visually, Dr. Walsh reported, her voice clinical but not without compassion. Significant trauma to the chest and torso. 1 wound penetrated the heart, likely the fatal injury. There's also a defensive wound on the left shoulder, suggesting the victim tried to fight back. Time of death appears to be between 6 and 7 this morning, but I'll be more precise after the autopsy. Morrison nodded, processing the information. She turned to the crime scene technicians who were methodically combing the area. One of them, a young man named Kevin Park, approached with an evidence bag containing a smartphone. "Detective, We found this about 3 feet from the body. It's not the victim's phone. Could belong to the perpetrator. Morrison took the bag, examining the device through the clear plastic. The screen was cracked, but the phone appeared otherwise intact. Have we attempted to access it yet? Not yet, Park replied. Waiting for your authorization. It's not locked, though. The screen damage might have disabled the security features. Let's get it to the lab immediately, Morrison instructed. I want everything on that phone extracted and analyzed. Call records, text messages, photos, apps, location data, everything. This could be our break. While the technical team worked on processing evidence, Morrison had the difficult task of informing Jennifer Thompson that her husband was dead. She drove to the Thompson residence with her partner, Detective James Holbrook, both officers steeling themselves for what was always the worst part of their job. They arrived at 11:15 to find Jennifer pacing in her driveway, her face etched with worry. The moment she saw the police vehicle pull up, Jennifer's expression transformed from anxiety to terror. Morrison introduced herself and Holbrook, and before she could say anything more, Jennifer whispered, "He's dead, isn't he?" "Michael is dead. Mrs. Thompson, I'm very sorry. We found your husband on the trail this morning. He was the victim of a violent attack. There was nothing anyone could have done." Morrison's words were practiced but genuine. She had delivered this news too many times, and it never became easier. Jennifer's legs gave out, and she collapsed onto her front steps, a wail of anguish erupting from deep within her. Holbrook moved quickly to support her, while Morrison called for victim services. The next hours passed in a blur of grief, questions, and procedures. Jennifer answered what she could through her tears. No, Michael had no enemies. No, there had been no threats against him. No, nothing unusual had happened recently. Yes, their marriage was strong. No, Michael was not involved in anything dangerous or illegal. He was just a financial analyst who ran every morning, a good man who harmed no one. Back at the police station, the smartphone discovered at the crime scene was yielding extraordinary results. The forensic team had successfully accessed the device, and what they found painted a chilling picture. The phone belonged to David Allen Richter, 33 years old, with an address in St. Paul. But more importantly, the phone contained hundreds of photographs of Jennifer Thompson, taken over many months from various distances and locations. Images of her leaving work, entering her home, shopping, having dinner with Michael. The surveillance had been extensive and obsessive. Text messages revealed even more disturbing information. While there were no direct communications between David and Jennifer beyond a single professional LinkedIn exchange from 2017, there were numerous unsent draft messages that David had composed but never delivered. These drafts revealed his obsession in explicit detail. He wrote about his love for Jennifer, his belief that they were meant to be together, his anger at Michael for keeping them apart. The messages were delusional and frightening in their intensity. Perhaps most damning was the location data. The phone's GPS history showed that David had been at Highland Lake Park Reserve at the exact time and location of Michael's murder. The digital trail was irrefutable. David Richter had been at the scene when Michael Thompson was killed, had been stalking Jennifer Thompson for months, and had left his phone behind at the murder scene. It was the kind of evidence that prosecutors dream about. Detective Morrison reviewed the findings with growing certainty. They had their suspect. Now they needed to find him. She issued an immediate bolo. Be on the lookout for David Richter and his vehicle, a 2008 Ford Explorer registered in his name. She contacted St. Paul police to conduct a welfare check at his apartment address. And she began building the case file that would eventually bring David Richter to justice. At 4:30 that afternoon, St. Paul officers knocked on the door of David's apartment. There was no answer. The landlord, contacted by police, unlocked the door and officers entered with weapons drawn. The apartment was empty, but what they found inside confirmed everything the phone evidence had suggested. One wall of David's bedroom was covered with printed photographs of Jennifer Thompson, dozens of them, arranged in a collage that resembled a shrine. There were newspaper clippings about Michael's promotion at Wells Fargo, There were handwritten notes detailing Jennifer and Michael's schedules, routes, and habits. It was the workspace of a stalker, and it demonstrated premeditation beyond any doubt. David Richter had fled, but he had not fled far. His obsession, even now, would not allow him to leave Minneapolis entirely. He had checked into a cheap motel near the airport using cash, watching news reports about Michael's murder on the television in his room. He told himself he felt no guilt, that what he had done was necessary. But as he sat alone in that anonymous room, covered in bruises from the fight, his hands still trembling, David Richter began to realize that his fantasy had been shattered by reality. Jennifer would not come to him. She would not understand. She would mourn Michael, and she would hate David if she ever learned the truth. The walls were closing in, and even David's fractured mind could sense it. Within 24 hours, every law enforcement officer in Minnesota would be searching for him. His face would be on every news broadcast. There would be no escape, no happy ending, no future with Jennifer. There was only the terrible weight of what he had done and the inevitable consequences racing toward him. David Richter's freedom lasted exactly 31 hours after he murdered Michael Thompson. On the morning of March 29th, a motel clerk recognized his face from the news broadcasts that had been playing continuously since the previous afternoon. The story of a beloved Wells Fargo executive brutally murdered during his morning run had captured the attention of the entire Twin Cities area. And when police released David's photograph and vehicle description, the response from the public was immediate and overwhelming. The clerk, a 58-year-old woman named Patricia Hernandez, had checked David into the Airport View Motel late on the 28th, accepting cash payment for 2 nights. She had noticed his disheveled appearance and the scratches on his face, but had assumed he was simply another traveler down on his luck. When she saw his photograph on the morning news, however, her blood ran cold. She immediately called 911 and kept watch on room 217, where David was staying, ensuring he did not leave before police arrived. Detective Morrison received the call at 7:45 and immediately dispatched tactical units to the motel. By 8:15, the building was surrounded by over 24 officers, including SWAT team members in full gear. Morrison herself arrived minutes later, coordinating the operation from a mobile command center set up in the parking lot. The goal was to take David into custody without incident, without giving him any opportunity to harm himself or others. At 8:30, the SWAT commander used a loudspeaker to call David out of the room. "David Richter, this is the Minneapolis Police Department. We have the building surrounded. Come out with your hands visible and empty. You will not be harmed if you comply peacefully." The announcement echoed across the parking lot, drawing the attention of other motel guests who watched from their windows with a mixture of fear and fascination. Inside room 217, David heard the announcement and felt the last remnants of his fantasy world collapse completely. He'd spent the night alternating between watching news coverage of Michael's murder and staring at photographs of Jennifer on his phone, trying to reconcile what he had done with what he believed he had been trying to accomplish. The news reports painted him as a monster, a stalker, a cold-blooded killer. They showed photographs of Michael smiling and alive, a good man with a bright future, stolen by senseless violence. They interviewed Jennifer's friends and Michael's colleagues, all expressing shock and grief. For the first time since his obsession began, David was forced to see himself through the eyes of others rather than through the distorted lens of his own delusions. He was not a romantic hero fighting for love. He was a murderer who had destroyed multiple lives, including his own. The realization brought neither redemption nor true understanding, but it did bring acceptance of his fate. There would be no escape, no future, no happy ending. There was only surrender. David opened the door of room 217 at 8:37, with his hands raised high above his head. He stepped into the morning sunlight, squinting against the brightness, and saw the array of weapons pointed in his direction. Officers rushed forward, throwing him to the ground and securing his hands behind his back with handcuffs. Within seconds, David Richter was in custody, and the manhunt that had gripped the Twin Cities for a day and a half was over. Detective Morrison approached as officers lifted David to his feet. She looked into his eyes, searching for some sign of remorse or understanding, but found only emptiness. "David Richter, you are under arrest for the murder of Michael Thompson. You have the right to remain silent." She read him his Miranda rights while cameras from news helicopters circled overhead, broadcasting the arrest live to thousands of viewers. The evidence against David was overwhelming and irrefutable. His smartphone placed him at the scene. His apartment demonstrated months of stalking and obsession. His DNA was found under Michael's fingernails from their struggle. Blood on his clothes matched Michael's blood type. Surveillance cameras at sporting goods stores confirmed his purchase of a hunting knife matching the weapon used in the attack. The knife itself was recovered from the crime scene, bearing David's fingerprints. No defense attorney could reasonably argue innocence in the face of such comprehensive evidence. David's trial began 7 months later. In October of 2019, the prosecution, led by Assistant District Attorney Catherine Hayes, presented their case methodically and devastatingly. They showed the jury the photographs David had taken of Jennifer, hundreds of them, documenting an obsession that spanned nearly 2 years. They presented the unsent text messages revealing his delusions. They called Jennifer to the stand, where she testified through tears that she had never encouraged David's attention, had rejected his single approach, and had believed their brief professional interaction in 2017 was meaningless and forgotten. Jennifer's testimony was heartbreaking. She described her marriage to Michael, their plans for the future, the morning she realized he was not coming home. She spoke of the devastating phone call from police, the moment her entire world shattered. And she addressed David directly, asking the question that haunted her: "Why did you take him from me? Michael never hurt you. He never even knew you existed. What gave you the right to destroy our lives?" David, sitting at the defense table, could not meet her eyes. His attorney had advised him not to testify, recognizing that any attempt to explain his actions would only make things worse. The defense strategy, such as it was, focused on mental illness, suggesting that David's obsession had rendered him incapable of understanding the wrongness of his actions. But the prosecution countered effectively, presenting evidence of David's careful planning, his attempts to avoid detection, and his flight after the murder. These were not the actions of someone unable to distinguish right from wrong. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning with their verdict. Guilty of first-degree murder. Guilty of stalking. Guilty on all counts. David showed no visible reaction as the verdict was read. But in the gallery, Jennifer broke down sobbing, held by family members who had supported her through 7 months of agonizing waiting. At sentencing 3 weeks later, Judge Margaret Chen delivered a statement that captured the tragedy of the case. "Mr. Richter, you have destroyed not one life but many. Michael Thompson was a good man, a loving husband, a valued member of his community. You took him from the world because of a fantasy that existed only in your mind. You stalked an innocent woman, terrorized her, and murdered her husband in a fit of obsessive rage. Your actions deserve the harshest penalty available under law." Judge Chen sentenced David Richter to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He was remanded immediately to custody and transferred to a maximum security facility where he would spend the remainder of his days. There would be no redemption, no second chance, no future beyond prison walls. For Jennifer Thompson, the guilty verdict and harsh sentence brought a measure of closure, but no real peace. Michael was still gone. The future they had planned together would never materialize. The child they had hoped to have would never know their father. Jennifer sold the house in Bloomington, unable to remain in a place filled with memories of what she had lost. She left her job at the advertising firm and eventually relocated to another state, seeking distance from the tragedy that had defined her life in Minnesota. The case became a cautionary tale about the dangers of obsession and the failures of systems meant to protect stalking victims. Jennifer had obtained a protective order after David's unwanted approach, but that piece of paper had done nothing to prevent Michael's murder. Advocacy groups used the case to push for stronger stalking laws and better enforcement mechanisms. Michael's death, tragic and senseless, at least prompted conversations about prevention and protection that might save future victims. David Richter sits in prison today, his obsession finally extinguished by the cold reality of what it cost him. He will die behind bars, forgotten by everyone except the people whose lives he destroyed. Jennifer Thompson continues to rebuild her life, carrying the weight of grief and loss, but determined to honor Michael's memory by living fully and completely. And in Bloomington, Minnesota, a small memorial marker stands along the trail where Michael Thompson took his final run, a reminder that evil can strike anywhere, anytime, and that vigilance and awareness are never wasted.